any particular character, any particular behavior you identify as interesting or would want to talk about?
I don't remember the characters' names, but I can just describe them. That's okay. I was thinking potentially the girl who was very like into carving the pumpkins and had left them at the lake. I was thinking like maybe like autism spectrum a little bit, because her behavior was very like she knew a lot about Halloween. She carved like a ton of pumpkins. It just seemed very like focused in that way to me. But that's basically what I was thinking for that character.
So the little girl who has the practical joke played on her.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Autism spectrum. Yeah, I think she absolutely demonstrates a clinically significant deficit of communication, likely on the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And certainly, as that established, a risk for bullying. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, there's a reason why the group singles her out. Mm-hmm. I think ASD is a relatively easy diagnosis to place in our differential, right, no doubt. Question I have, let's say, and I don't know if such a movie exists, Trick or Treat 2 comes out. And we have this character now at 18 years of age, and she presents to you with clinically significant disorganized communication and behavior. And we think this may be schizophrenia, because they are two diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. What are some of the things we have to consider here? Assuming that she presents to us with some clinically significant change in behavior or functional deficit.
I think age of onset is important.
Well, how old is she in this movie?
She looks like she's probably maybe like preteen. Am I off with that?
How old?
I'm not sure. Like maybe preteens. Like
Preteens.
Probably.
So,
Are they in middle school or high school? Maybe it's a little older.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be reasonable to assume, given this particular character, that these deficits that we're seeing in the original, in the movie we're currently discussing, are a pre-existing condition. Mm-hmm. So 8 or 9, right? So 8 or 9.
And also want to, we want to look for the symptoms, so the negative symptoms, as well as to see if there's any positive symptoms, hallucinations, delusions. But we want to rule out any general medical conditions, any drugs, things like that.
The first step for the psychiatrist is always to rule out the physiologic effect of substances, as well as any underlying medical conditions. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to discuss her behavior as a potential mental disorder, we'll have to say that has been investigated and that has been ruled out. Mm-hmm. In a similar way, in terms of the behavior we observed in the movie we're discussing today, the original Trick or Treat, I think we also have to make sure we have addressed this and we are a consensus in that this has been ruled out. Mm-hmm. Now that we're talking about potential mental illness, the idea of there being delusions or hallucinations is probably something we need to focus on in the sequel. Mm-hmm. How come? The reason why is because the American Psychiatric Association has stated that in order to rule in schizophrenia, in order to rule in schizophrenia, we have to rule out an autism spectrum disorder. So that's noteworthy here. So that when in the sequel she presents with clinically significant disorganized behavior and communication, the fact that she has an established autism spectrum disorder because this group has just made that clinical decision in analyzing Trick or Treat, we have a difficult time saying that this appears to be nuanced as schizophrenia, unless there are additional signs of schizophrenia that would not be explained by a pre-existing ASD. And the two that often come up, hallucinations and delusions. So whether or not this character has schizophrenia in our sequel will have everything to do with whether you, as the writer, producer, want to include hallucinations and or delusions as part of her plot summary. That's the bottom line there. So that remains to be seen what the script looks like.
Yeah.
In the absence of those, it's going to be real difficult to say that the sequel is about schizophrenia when we know there's a pre-existing ASD, and that's per the American Psychiatric Association. Other characters you want to analyze today, talking about trick or treat.
I can put up another one. I can put up another one. The character, I don't know his name again, sorry. He was like the overweight child hanging out with the principal, who the principal killed. He shows signs of conduct disorder. He's stealing, smashing pumpkins, and it's funny because then the principal's like, oh, like my dad, or that's what I was also like when I was a kid, and then you see that he might like have antisocial personality disorder, so it fits in with that whole like narrative.
Yeah,
So.
it actually, this movie does a decent job of teaching us very specific aspects of antisocial personality, and that means the evidence of conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. This child is younger than 15.
Yeah.
And what he's doing seems to be consistent with conduct, which means that in our sequel, by the way, maybe we should be making this, although he dies.
The kid dies.
Yeah, so that's not going to work. But anyway, if he didn't die, and if he did appear in our sequel, certainly we would probably have him look very similar to the principal, which would be consistent with what the principal tells him. That I was like you when I was a child, when I was a kid. Right? So, sure, the principal does appear to manifest that cardinal feature. We discussed this morning, that the multitude of the personality disorders do adhere to a cardinal feature. And for the antisocial personality disorder, it's a blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights. That's the principle. And then we see his history reflected in the child. It's not Timmy, is it?
Billy.
Billy.
That's the only name I remember. But I was gonna ask you, like, is there like a hereditary, like a higher instance of antisocial personality disorder in families? Like, because I was just curious, or is it more like raised in that environment type?
Every answer to this question is always going to include the words or hyphenated word biopsychosocial.
Okay.
I think many theorists, clinicians believe more psychosocial than bio.
Okay.
So it could, but the fact is that environmental factors likely have more weight than the biological factors. So Billy, with the evidence of conduct prior to the age of 15, set up for a sequel in which he develops antisocial personality disorder, which, ironically, is manifested in his principal, who tells him that he was like Billy when he was a child. It's interesting. Yep, I agree. Any other characters for discussion? Trick or treat.
I'll talk about Sam, like the little kid.
Sam.
And I'm not gonna get wrong, but he's a kid with the costume, right? Like the orange, like, and he had the bag. We don't really know what's in the bag. It was like candy or stuff. So, and he had like not an addiction, but he really liked chocolate, which has like the caffeine right in it.
Yep, and that's a clinical pearl. The food or drink with the highest density of caffeine is chocolate. So if you're treating someone with anxiety and you're reviewing foods that they should avoid, we all think of coffee. Do not forget about chocolate. Right?
Wow.
Sad?
I eat a lot of chocolate.
Yeah, me too. That explains so much.
I think you took the mask on, that the frown came down.
Oh my gosh, I'm shook.
Sam. Who is Sam, by the way? If you want to look at this from a folkloric standpoint, and just lose the psychiatrist count for a second. Any thoughts about what this character is?
In like what regards? What do you mean?
I don't know, I mean, you're looking at this movie like a normal person, not through a psychiatrist's lens. What do you think this ghoul is?
It's kind of like the embodiment of like Halloween, like the spirit of Halloween,
Spirit of Halloween?
sort of.
Alright. Why do you say that?
Because it's like the idea of like the child in the costume. Like he's up in the costume the entire time with his bag, like the candy, and he's like this mischievous kid who just goes around and but like I guess he's kind of a demon. I'm not so sure.
He's always there when terrible things happen.
He is.
He's always there, like at the end of it, you can see him there, and it's kind of like I don't know if he's the one like causing all of these terrible things to happen, like in some demonic sense, but it's kind of like him making sure that Halloween goes according to plan.
Is he good or bad then?
Depends where you're looking.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and I agree with you, if he's the spirit of Halloween, there's a good side to this, right? He's the enforcer to ensure that the ritual of Halloween are not violated, or is not violated. Because when, in the opening scene, she blows out the candles, she sets the stage for all this to happen, because she conjures Sam. In that way, I think he's a ghost. He was a person, and now I think he's the spirit of Halloween. I think spirit here is taken loosely. I actually think he's a ghost. And he upholds the actual rituals of the holiday. By the way, what's the original holiday's name?
All
Before that.
All Souls Day.
Before that.
It's very
I forget what she
Catholic.
said.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I get that.
I can't remember what you said it was.
Samhain, right? The fear of Halloween is Samhainophobia, right? Short Sam. I don't think that was my mistake. He is the spirit of Halloween. And because he is, I think that with this character, we have this dualism, because there is an aspect of him that is needed. We see this actually, I think, most prominently in Clive Barker's Hellbound Heart, which is adapted to film in a movie named Hellraiser, where the Cenobites are considered to be demons to some, angels to others. Right? That's the tagline from that movie. And I think the same thing applies to Sam. I think he is a ghost to some, but an angel to others. So, very complicated character, and I think the main character in this movie, the very spirit of the movie. And the other characters. And given that, I am not sure how to tie in his caffeinism, right? His caffeine use disorder. I'm not sure where exactly that fits.
All the
Just like
energy depleted in all those places at the same time, or not at the same time, very quickly.
It's fueling his presence.
The one thing I will say, I mean, this kind of will piggyback the next film that we talk about at noon, which is Hoodwink, is to distinguish this condition, caffeine use disorder, specifically caffeine intoxication, from stimulant intoxication. Somebody presents with clinically significant hyperadrenergic drive, right? Looks like a panic attack. We find out that it's drug use, which of course is going to be one of the very first things we think about, right? The direct and physiologic effects of the substance. Given that, how do you distinguish between that which is induced by a stimulant like cocaine versus caffeine? Because you look at the DSM criteria for intoxication, boy, is there significant overlap here.
You just don't you have to do like a urine drug screen?
All right, so you've gotten one. That's
Okay.
pending,
Oh.
right?
Gosh.
Caffeine's not part of a routine UDS, so that's not going to help you.
If it's caffeine, it won't be there.
Right. And Coke is very short-lived in the urine, so
Yeah.
you know, a negative test is not going to tell you all that much.
If there's a nosebleed,
Sure, if there's evidence, physical exam evidence, right, of the route of administration, right? Right. What will tip you off that it's the PO route and therefore more consistent with caffeine intoxication?
Like stained teeth?
Hmm?
Like staining of the teeth from.
Sure, with chronic use, sure. gastric upset.
Yeah.
The abdominal pain we see with cocaine and other stimulants is due to the vasoconstriction of the splanchnic vasculature. So it's a visceral, acute abdominal pain. That is different than the quality of GI distress caused by caffeine, which is PO belt, different in quality. The other thing to consider is that
Yeah, I have a question. Can you also see some slight changes on EKG, like
Yes.
minimal ST, like not necessarily elevations, but like depressions even?
I believe you can with caffeine,
Yeah.
of course.
Oh, with
if you-
caffeine as well?
Yeah, I think you can. I have to double check that. But with cocaine, any evidence of myocardial ischemia is much more likely
Much more
to be
likely to be
cocaine.
cocaine.
Yeah, so yeah, that will definitely point you towards cocaine-induced even acute MI.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I wanted to draw a parallel to the caffeine use and Halloween, where with a stimulant you become irritable and you become more prone to being afraid or more prone to being paranoid. So that might be possibility to doubt it, but then trying to induce the hyperfear state, induce the paranoia that would come with being on a stimulant.
Yeah, I think there are behavioral signs outside of the physiologic that are more specific
Mhm.
to the stimulant. The other physiologic cause I want you to keep in mind, twofold. Number one, facial flushing is in the DSM criteria for caffeine intoxication. It's not for stimulant. And the other one is diuresis. Diuresis is in the DSM criteria for caffeine intoxication. It is not part of the definition of cocaine intoxication or stimulant intoxication. So diuresis, facial flushing, more specific to caffeine. The GI upset/pain is qualitatively different in the two as well, if you could distinguish it.
What about pupil dilation? Would you still see that equally in both?
Yes.
Okay.
And the withdrawal symptoms might be different as well.
That's right.
Like the cocaine, you might see like diarrhea.
What will cocaine withdrawal look like? If you had to sum it up in a single word.
Depressive.
Yeah. Right, it's an episode of depression. Right, 3 words. Caffeine withdrawal is not, right? Caffeine withdrawal, for those of you who have missed your morning cup of coffee, know that it starts with a headache. But then it gets to anxiety and irritability afterwards, which is much different than cocaine withdrawal. Good. All right, any other thoughts about trick or treat? Any other characters?
We're just gonna slap some diagnosis on somebody. Maybe with the bus driver, like schizoid. He seems like he's like lives by himself, doesn't want to be bothered by anybody else. But obviously, this is just me watching the movie and being like.
No, I agree. No, I agree. Now, I don't know to what extent that trauma, despite the fact that he caused it, results in his becoming socially isolated. We don't know. Certainly, if we see evidence of social isolation during or prior to that event, yeah, oh yeah, schizoid. Now, there's a couple things I want to say about the schizoid personality. Number one, it is a cluster A personality, so we'll start out with the DSM classification and categories, cluster A. And number two, if we were going to reorganize and create our own category system, it's in column A again, where we have that cardinal trait, where the individual is socially isolated and actually prefers to not interact with people. That's the schizoid personality. Defense mechanism, right? Defense mechanisms are subconscious process. They're subcortical. Their focus, their goal is to alleviate anxiety. Right? Without them, we're anxious. Any idea what defense mechanism results in the behavioral manifestation of social isolation?
Avoid.
That's the Clark?
Was it fantasy?
Fantasy, exactly right. Fantasy is described as an autistic retreat into an inner world, so as to protect oneself from the external threat of the external world, of the real world. Fantasy. Now this is normal when age appropriate.
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah, it's described as an autistic retreat into one's creation of an inner world.
So, if somebody has that trait, is that diagnostic of autism, or is it just an autistic tendency?
So it's an autistic tendency.
Okay.
Autism or an autism spectrum disorder has separate clinical criteria that you must reach.
Yeah.
This is just a defense.
Yeah.
This is just a subconscious process so as to alleviate anxiety,
Okay.
where an individual cannot tolerate reality,
Okay.
right? There's an impulse that is striving for conscious awareness and expression. And for the individual to allow conscious awareness of that impulse would be too threatening.
Yeah.
So that impulse must be thwarted, and the way we thwart these impulses is to employ defense mechanisms to keep them subconscious.
Okay.
One of which is called fantasy.
Okay.
2-year-old, 3-year-old has an impulse that my parent hates me because they're no longer omnipresent. They leave me alone in a room now. Where are they? Because in a prior life, they help me all of the time. That's an impulse that's coming or yearning for conscious expression, but it's way too threatening for the child. What's going to happen? Defense mechanism, fantasy. Could you give me an example of a behavioral manifestation of this process in this 3-year-old?
Imaginary
Unfortunately.
crimes, yeah.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Perfectly normal for the 4-year-old.
Right.
It's a form of self-soothing. It's another way of saying it. Right? It's not so normal for the 24-year-old.
Mhm.
So we could see that when it's age inappropriate, how this can result in quote-unquote bizarre behavior,
Mhm.
right? Including that of a bus driver. All subconscious. If we make this more of a cortical process, right, where the individual actually has magical thinking, we cross the line from the schizoid to the schizotypal personality.
Mhm.
So one is a subcortical process, a defense mechanism. The other one is a cortical process, magical thinking, an actual belief in the paranormal or clairvoyant when it's clinically significant. And when that belief is clinically significant. That's more consistent with the schizotypal personality. Now, again, the fact that at the end, this bus driver is visited by Sam. Does he cross that line? Because this tends to happen. That individuals who have a schizoid personality can begin to incorporate magical thinking and therefore have a diagnosis that's changed or amended. And so I think this bus driver character allows for the discussion of how these personality disorders are incredibly artificial and people can actually cluster, hence the name, and demonstrate clinically significant aspects of multiple. That's why they're in these different groups or clusters, A, B, and C. All right. Any other thoughts about trick or treat? 20 to the hour, so we'll leave 20 minutes to hard candy. All right, so hard candy. Where would you like to start? When we're done recording, remind me. I have a very disturbing encounter to relate to you when I saw this in the movies. I just don't want to put it on tape. You guys are more than welcome to do this as well. We're going to shut down the
Is this
recording.
audio or visual recording?
This is audio, right?
Yeah, it's all audio.
Yeah, only audio.
Yeah, no faces. So.
So I couldn't think of any real diagnoses for the two main characters, but I guess I was sort of looking at defense mechanisms that each of them were employing. For example, it seems like, I forget the character's name, but the pedophile's character, Jeff, was it? His character seemed to be employing suppression throughout the whole time, essentially. Well, sometimes it would break through when he was getting frustrated. But like his whole life was tailored to suppress the fact that he had this sort of impulse of pedophilia, I guess, so that he wouldn't let any of it leak through.
So, well, let's start with the low-hanging fruit. I mean, this movie is about pedophilia, and pedophilia is a mental disorder. It's also a crime. I mean, you could be both, right? And pedophilia is both. And this movie is, at least from one perspective, about a mental disorder. So let's talk about pedophilia. Pedophilia is a paraphilia, meaning that it is a sexual deviancy. Previously, DSM-4, up until 2013, we had one chapter called the Sexual Disorders chapter, and it was broken down into 3 parts, one of which was the sexual deviancies, aka the paraphilias. Do we know what the other 2 parts of that chapter was?
Sexual disorders?
Yeah. Sexual dysfunctions. And then the 3rd part was what is currently known as gender dysphoria. DSM-5, as of 2013, the American Psychiatric Association took that single chapter and divided it up into 3 separate chapters with the same chapter headings. The paraphilias, or the sexual deviancies, the sexual dysfunctions, and gender identity disorder, right? Now known as gender dysphoria. That's the main change as of 2013. Where the focus is on the depression or dysphoria resulting from one's perceived mismatch from their assigned sex at birth, their sex assignment, and their experienced gender, resulting in dysphoria. How did everyone here, I think you may have heard this before, so if you have, I'm going to ask you not to say it, learn the planets of our solar system. So, I ask you guys to reach way back to grammar school.
I know that there was some, like some phrase you could say.
Give me it.
Acronym, yeah.
Some acronym. I
acronym.
cannot
But
remember it.
I was like a space nut, so I just knew them.
That's awesome.
My very like energetic, elegant, or whatever mother. Oh God.
You're right.
Something about buying pizzas or something. I can't remember.
9 pizzas. Something about 9 pizzas.
Exactly right, right?
Yeah. Oh wow.
It's
TBT.
always about my very educated or enthusiastic
Okay.
mother. The question I want to pose today is, what about your very educated father? Nobody ever talks about him.
He didn't fit the acronym.
Well, he's going to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My very educated father serves porn for thrills. And as soon as you understand that, you now know all the paraphilias. Let's go in order. My M. Guess? Masochistic disorder. Before we go any further, I just want to make a quick comment with regard to the transition from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. The DSM-4 changed in that the APA put the word disorder at the end of each of these abnormal behaviors because of their clinical significance. If an abnormal behavior, that is a behavior outside of a culturally sanctioned norm, is not clinically significant, we would call it, for example, masochism. A psychiatrist should not render any opinion on masochism. When the masochism results in clinically significant impairment, then we call it masochistic disorder, and that is a mental illness. Right? So having said that, just for purposes of just using less syllables this morning, we'll call it masochism, but I now understand that you know what that really means, right? So what is masochism?
Enjoying like pain with sex or hurting people with sex,
Right.
or
Remember-
alongside, not with.
Right. Remember that for each of these disorders, the action must result in sexual gratification, because if not, then it's not a sexual disorder. Right? So if the action results in sexual gratification, for instance, enjoying or seeing others harmed or hurt, we'll call it masochism. And when that behavior results in clinically significant impairment, we're going to call it masochistic disorder. But that's something we have to keep in mind for all of these. Very, V. Good. Voyeurism. Watching unsuspecting adults during sex or disrobing. 4, sexual gratification. and clinically significant. E, educated. Exhibitionism. Exposing oneself for sexual gratification, exhibitionism. When clinically significant, exhibitionist disorder. Father, F.
Fetishism?
Fetish, good. Serfs, S.
Sadism?
Sadism, good. Porn, P. Pedophilia, that's Jeff. 4, F. Frauderism.
Excuse me?
Frauderism.
D, Don, Potter?
Frauderism.
Okay, fraud.
Right? Being a fraudeur. I say it enough, it doesn't sound right. T, thrills. Transvestic. Fetishism. Cross-dressing as a fetish. My very educated father serves porn for thrills. Again, masochism, voyeurism, exhibitionism, fetishism, sadism, pedophilia, frauderism, transvestic fetish. Let's talk about Jeff. We diagnosed him with pedophilia. Anything else going on here? So we said that we think, this one's tough because what would be the impulse that Jeff has that appears he might find threatening if it comes to conscious awareness?
Taking pictures of younger girls.
Yeah, right? His fantasies and his actual actions of prepubescent girls. However, not only does he allow those impulses to come to conscious awareness, but then he acts on his thoughts. So if we think this is a suppression, we have to kind of talk through this. How do we think that suppression may be a defense that Jeff uses here?
I was sort of saying suppression is activities with other people, is what I was getting at.
Well, I think you might be right with regard to his pedophilic impulses, right? Because what is suppression? What's the definition of this defense mechanism?
Denial. Conscious denial.
No?
Sort of consciously setting aside an impulse
Until when?
until later.
Yeah.
Until you can
Right?
engage in it. Okay,
Right.
Makes sense.
So when it's safe,
Yeah.
right? When it's safe to allow for the expression. And not when it's legal, but when it's safe. So this may be suppression, right? Because if he were to bring this out at the coffee shop, he may get in trouble. He may get caught. So he suppresses the impulse until he has the young girl back at his apartment. It might be suppression. In a perverted way, but it's still a suppression. Anything else with you?
Quick question. Where does ancestry fall?
Incest?
Incest.
Because almost every behavior can be made into a sexual act, it would be impossible to publish the DSM by naming all of the potential paraphilias.
Mm-hmm.
So after the top 9, the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, understood that we have to create a grab bag category called NOS. And that's where it falls. So bestiality, necrophilia, NOS. Right? The absence of a specific name doesn't say that the APA understands then that they're normal. Far from it. But it's an NOS category because there's not enough ink to actually put them all on the page.
So the reason why pedophilia has its own category as opposed to these other interests is just like a nomenclature thing?
Well, it's a nomenclature thing, but it's a nomenclature thing that's itself built on incidents, right?
It's more credible.
Yeah. What else with Jeff? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, it's okay. I'm not sure if this is like a defense mechanism specifically, but it mentions voyeurism, and the camera is the ultimate voyeurism, you know, for forever. You know, you take a photo. So it seems like to me kind of satiates his more maladaptive pedophilia traits for voyeurism, because Ellen Page Haley, I believe her name is, in the film, talks about how he's filled his entire house with pictures he's taken of these young girls. So he literally has photos of his voyeurism displayed like souvenirs, I think she calls them, like around the whole house. So it's kind of like he's taken one very illegal thing and then kind of satiates it until it's, like you said, safe with his voyeurism. So I guess that would be kind of suppression in a way. He's suppressing his pedophilia through kind of a legal way where he's taking pictures and participating in voyeurism.
That may be more sublimation.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Right, and maybe more sublimation, which is a more artistic expression of the forbidden impulse.
Yeah.
A more artistic expression of the pedophilic impulse.
Yeah, just finding a way around it.
Good pickup. Any other thoughts? How about Haley?
Also along the lines of defense mechanisms, it seemed like she was using acting out her whole sort of campaign.
Now, acting out is defined as an observable action on an impulse so as to ensure the impulse does not come to conscious awareness. So as the impulse is yearning for conscious expression, we're going to feel that as our alarm of pending internal threat. The closer and closer it gets to conscious expression, the more resounding that alarm, until a defense mechanism kicks in so as to disengage, disarm, and alleviate that anxiety. One way to do this through acting out would be to just turn to the person next to you, punch them. That anxiety goes right down. Right? That's acting out. Right? We see that here?
Not exactly, because she's acting on her conscious thoughts.
Yeah, she's very premeditated. It would be hard to say that this is a product of an impulse. She's very premeditated here.
Could you say like antisocial? Well, I mean, I guess since this is younger, be more misconduct. But I guess if there was like a sequel to the movie, which is older, you could say antisocial. She continues in this behavior of not really, like just like hurting people and not thinking about how they're feeling. That jumped out at me in the beginning, but she kind of cared for him when she was like doing the procedure on him, where she worried about him feeling the pain. And she like iced him, so that kind of contradicted that idea.
So I'm agreeable with regard to the assessment of conduct disorder here. However, we have to be very careful. Is this who Haley is? That is, do we feel as though this is part of her personality, or do we think she is demonstrating misconduct as a result of her friend dying at the hands of a pedophile? Because if there's no evidence of any of these types of behaviors prior to her friend's death, then I'm not so sure we have conduct disorder here. So that was a tough call. The prequel will inform us. It doesn't exist, but if it did, it would give us greater direction of whether or not Hard Candy is a film about conduct disorder and its main character, Haley. Let's assume, though, that it does. And Haley has traits consistent with conduct disorder. Therefore, she has traits consistent with a future antisocial personality. Right? Let's just hypothetically say that's in place here. What about that castration? You said that she feels genuine empathy or sympathy for him in as much as down. What's going on here? Everybody agree?
Seemed like she might be being a little facetious with the empathy. I don't know.
So you didn't trust her?
Not exactly. Or I have doubts.
You have doubts?
I think a lot of it too is like, that's a very bold line to cross, and that's very easy to mess up, and if we are to believe she's, 14, or like whatever age, she has to make him believe it, so in a way it's even more, not diabolical, but I think constructed, because she had to go get the tape, she had to write this whole backstory about her dad being a med, professor, which, may or may not. Also, who's gonna let their child sit in on that, so it's like kind of very interesting, it's premeditated. She has to like strategically plan how to make him believe to do that, while like believe it's even more, I think, constructive than if she actually did it. But also simultaneously, there's no evidence that she did it. So now, he has this belief, but nothing technically happened. So no evidence.
Yeah, first of all, with regard to the words she speaks during the castration, there is zero chance that any of that is true. I mean, remember, her plan is for him to kill himself. That's the whole plan here. That rope is on the roof the whole time. So anything she is saying that would be interpreted as her being genuinely caring for him during that scene absolutely is debunked. There's no chance of it. Number two, the reason why she provides ice is to make sure he doesn't feel the elastic bands. And what she's really doing, which is basically just touching him, not cutting him. Right? It's a form of anesthesia, local. He can't feel it. So he thinks he's getting castrated. Without the ice, he's going to realize she's doing nothing down there. Right? So she's got to provide some form of local anesthesia. She would not be icing him down if she had lidocaine. Right? So that ice has only one purpose, and that is to ensure that her plan is successful and that he truly believes he's being castrated. It's not to ease his pain or help his pain. Right? So I agree with the conduct disorder assessment if there is evidence of conduct prior to her friend dying. Because if this is all reaction to the death of a loved one, then it's much more complicated, and it's not likely to be conduct disorder.
With the main character here, I encountered the same problem I had when I was trying to think about the main character of Jigsaw, where I don't know how to describe an individual where they have this sort of, this need to enact justice on other people that have done something that they consider to be against their own moral beliefs, and they'll go through any extent in order to get that justice, in order to make sure that the people pay for their crimes. I'm sure that I was looking for a disorder that kind of covers that, and I came across social vigilantism, and I didn't know if that was appropriate in this case or in the Jigsaw case, but that was the closest thing I could find to something like that, where somebody would go through any length to accomplish their own social justice.
So with regard, is it vigilant or vigilante?
Vigilantism.
Because that's not a clinical diagnosis that is accepted by the American Psychiatric Association. However, I think social vigilantism is part of the diagnosis of the antisocial personality disorder, not in the actual word used per se, but in the diagnostic criterion that states that there's a violation of social norms. Because the social norm is that you leave that to law enforcement. And the individual is innocent until proven guilty by a jury of their peers. And to say, no, that is not the way I operate.
Mm-hmm.
I operate through social vigilantism is a diagnostic criterion of the antisocial personality. Right? So that's the way I would kind of frame that, to remain consistent with the APA nomenclature. The interesting thing here is that if we're looking at Haley as probably having, or possibly having conduct disorder, we talked about sequels of both of these movies. How awesome would it be to have Haley and Billy be in that film?
Right, just hanging out, being antisocial.
Two antisocials. Is there any way we can flip it that he didn't really die in that movie? That seeing his death as a product of the principal's mind? bring these two together, because it really does connect trick or treat and hard candy, which, you know, obviously should be connected anyway. By the way, both of these movies contain the wolf motif, right? She's a wolf, right? This is a Little Red Riding Hood motif. If you've seen the marquee, if you've seen the movie poster, if you've seen the taglines to this film, you know that this is a wolf motif. This is Little Red Riding Hood, which of course is a character in Trick or Treat as well. The wolf motif. Who is Little Red Riding Hood? She's a werewolf. Trick or Treat. Right? Which is why I chose the muffin tops for this morning, to get us to this very point. Right? It's the werewolf. That's where these two movies come together. That's where these three pieces come together if we include our discussion of Seinfeld this morning. Right? Anything else with regard to hard candy? We're right at noon, so let's call it.